Well, good morning, everyone. I'm UVA President Teresa Sullivan, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this panel on race, religion, and gender. This is the last event in our Women's Global Leadership Forum before the closing session this afternoon. So I do want to take this opportunity to thank all of the forum's extraordinary speakers for sharing their time and talents with us. And I thank the staff who worked hard to organize this program for many months. And of course, thank you, the audience, for your engagement and participation. So last August 11th and 12th, after hundreds of white supremacists marched through our grounds, and after an innocent woman lost her life in violence in downtown Charlottesville on the 12th, along with 2 state troopers who died in a tragic accident, the nation and the world looked to UVA to see how we would respond. In that moment, our collective work to pursue equality and justice became even more urgent. Our message from the UVA community to white supremacists and other messengers of hate, then and now, is simply this: bigotry and violence have no place at the university. We will continue to protect the constitutional rights to free speech and free assembly at UVA, but we will vigorously protect our community. We will remain united in the face of bigotry and violence, and we will oppose hate wherever it presents itself. It will take time for this community to recover fully from that assault on our people and their values. It may take even longer to comprehend the beliefs and energies that produce this kind of hate, but we must work to comprehend them so we can fight them and ultimately defeat them. So I asked that we add this conversation about race, religion, and gender to the forum agenda. And I invited the one person who seemed best qualified to moderate the panel session. David Gergen brings an extraordinary background and vast experience to this discussion. He has served as a counselor to 4 U.S. presidents: Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. He captured those remarkable experiences in his New York Times bestseller, Eyewitness to Power: The Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. A journalist by training and a frequent commentator on CNN, David uses his experience to help audiences understand and dig more deeply into the critical issues of racial justice and inequality. In news cycles dominated by charges of fake news, David focuses on the facts. David is a scholar and a mentor to the next generation of young people who aspire to lead democratic institutions. As director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School, he leads a center that provides 100 student scholarships each year to prepare women and men to serve the common good. David is known for putting his students first, as we learned firsthand when planning the session. He delayed his departure from Cambridge yesterday until 8 in the evening so he could teach his class and honor his commitments to his students. That's the kind of faculty-student dedication that we treasure at UVA. David, thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing members of your family with you. And thank you for your service to the Academy and to our country. Ladies and gentlemen, David Gergen.
Thank you. Teresa, thank you very, very much, and we salute you as you conclude your tenure here at the university. These have not been easy years, but they've been growth years, and you've guided the university to a better place, so we thank you for that. And it seems it seems particularly fitting, doesn't it, that UVA began its first century, UVA began its second century as a men's-only institution. And now as it begins its third century, women are here at the top at a summit and right at the forefront. And that's occurred under your leadership. So we thank you again for that. I'm delighted to be here. This is a time for all of us that has, lots of tensions, anxieties, fears about where we're going. My oldest brother, John, is here with his wife, Jacqueline. John and I grew up in North Carolina. And growing up in a segregated southern community, it has been quite striking to me how much North Carolina has prospered in recent years. But the difference has been that the kids who walked across the Pettus Bridge, the kids who got their heads beat in, really brought down the barriers between the races to a considerable degree in our part of the country. And when the barriers between the races started to fall, the barriers between the South, between North Carolina and the rest of the nation started to fall, and we grew to be a more prosperous people. And it matters whether you can bring these barriers down. And now many of us are worried, are new barriers going up? The barriers going up these days, or are they going down? Are they going up on race and going down on gender? What's going on? What's been happening here in Charlottesville, where the feelings are still very raw about what happened in August? And yet there are signs of hope in other parts of the country and in the world. And we want to have a broad-ranging discussion that brings in some of the international side, but we also want an opportunity to focus on race and religion and gender here in the United States. That's going to be the main topic of our conversation. Now, I have just met physically for the first time the members of our panel, and I think what I ought to do is ask each of them to identify themselves briefly. We'll get a station identification. Station identification is very important, as you know. And then I want to pose the first question to Risa, but let's first begin immediately to my left with Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who has just retired after 35 years of distinguished service to the Foreign Service.
Good morning, everyone. And I do like to introduce myself as a Foreign Service officer. I was a career Foreign Service officer until about 6 weeks ago, and I served the government with tremendous pleasure over these past 35 years. I, too, also grew up in the segregated South. I'm from Louisiana, and I still consider myself to be from Louisiana, although I've lived around the world over the past 35 years. I'm currently working at Georgetown University as a distinguished fellow of the practice of diplomacy, and I look forward to engaging with you in this discussion today.
Good, terrific. To her left, to Linda's left, is Risa Goluboff. I hope I got that right.
Lovely.
Okay, good. I'll only do it once. I'll keep you right.
You're good.
Risa is the first female dean of the law school, the 12th dean of the law school, and she's important responsibilities we'll be talking about in a moment in response to Charlottesville.
So I actually grew up in the North, so I'm a Yankee, but I studied Southern history and civil rights history, and I spent a lot of time in the South, the last 15 years here at the University of Virginia, 14 years as a faculty member at the law school and in the history department, and the last year and a half as the dean of law school. And I think I'm sitting here for a number of reasons. One, as the dean of the law school. The second, as the chair of the university-wide Dean's Working Group that President Sullivan put together after August 11th and 12th to think about and help the university think about how to respond to those events. But I'm also, by training, a civil rights historian and a scholar of the Constitution and civil rights law. And so I think about these events both in kind of long historical time and then also in asking questions, what should the law do? How should we be thinking about the future? How has the law shaped the story that David told earlier?
And to, thank you. And to Risa's left is Gregory Fairchild. Greg is here with the Darden School, and distinguished member of the faculty there, and has been widely recognized in one survey after another as one of the best business school professors in the country. Greg.
Well, David, I first want to say, the day that I saw the announcement that President Sullivan was going to be our next president, I felt such a sense of a turn, just as you said. Not only because of gender, and of course we're here for that reason, or that's the primary topic. You know, so much of what I actually looked at her research record or scholarship, and it actually relates to these very concepts and topics we're talking about. And I was inspired that someone that's been thinking about the way communities connect and don't connect would be leading our university. I care about those things because I actually am a segregation scholar, even though I'm in the business school. I think a lot and talk a lot about the way labor markets and businesses are constrained by the very separations that you describe. And sometimes that's a challenge for people to get their heads around, that it is these individual, social, personal, institutional interactions that either, when we demolish them, enhance the opportunity for economic growth, but when we hold them steady, it holds us back.
Right.
You know, like Risa, I think I'm here probably because of some of the work I do. 17 years ago, I chose to bring my family here. Those people who know me know that I'm in an interracial marriage. My wife is in the room. We have 3 children. You know, I've shared this with a number of people, and I'll just be very brief. My son, a few years ago in elementary school, had a unit in history where his teacher had told him about the Klan. And he came home, he was deathly afraid because of the violence that was associated with the Klan. And he's now 14, but at the time, and this is the important part, I said, well, you know, the Klan is a marginal organization, and that was history, and those types of things are things you need to worry about. And obviously, we did. So I think I sit here not only because, like Risa, like Linda, because of the work we do, but I sit here also as a member of the community who was shocked that I was wrong. Oh, say more about that? Okay. That's one of my lines. So you know, I was sharing with Risa as we came in, and I grew up in an entirely integrated life. My father was a career military officer. And in 1954, President Truman signed an executive order which allowed a very important thing to happen. It allowed, during the Korean War, military units to be integrated. My father was finishing his ROTC training at Hampton Institute, and he graduated in 1954. He was one of the few black officers to command integrated units. Even as the life he'd led in Oklahoma and here in Virginia at Hampton Institute had not been so integrated, he was now charged with dealing with the realities of a forced integration. In 1963, Robert McNamara signed a Defense Department order which said that all housing and all schools off base must integrate forthwith, and the U.S. military would use its economic force to force integration in those communities. My parents got married in 1963. So I never actually attended a segregated school or lived in a segregated community. And as I sit here as a person in my 50s, that's unusual in America. And I think many of us labor under an illusion that, in fact, the life I had would be the traditional when it, in fact, isn't. And so as we fast forward, this community, to me and my family, has been wonderfully embracing. Mm-hmm. And so when I was talking to my son, I realized that perhaps in some ways I've been in a bubble, both the bubble I grew up in. I had learned that my military upbringing was different than America as a generality. But I still thought, on the basis of the environment we're in here, I thought that, again, this was done. And the messages and lessons from my childhood that what I'd seen in the military was a bubble. When my father retired from the military and I came out in public schools in the state of Virginia, I learned that segregation was quite real. And I'm drawing a linkage in that, for me, the events of August 12th reminded me that perhaps in some ways I've been in a bubble again.
That's interesting. It's interesting. It is worth pointing out that those integrated schools for the military actually were some of the most successful schools in the country. And they were integrated.
I don't want to at all spend too much time here, but I think what surprises people is what studies will tell you are two things that are interesting. The DoD schools, as you call them, are one of the few school systems that have not had achievement gaps. And those of you who are education scholars will know that. Number two, there are now studies of people like me that grew up in military environments and the way we view race as adults and the decisions we make and the types of communities we live in. And it turns out that we tend to have more integrated views of the world and more integrated lives than those that didn't grow up that way.
Yeah, striking. Risa, Teresa appointed you to head up a faculty committee to shine light on how we got here in Charlottesville and the demonstrations, and where is the path forward. Could you help us first understand, and you have to do this more briefly than it deserves, but how did we go from 50 years ago when the people out marching were marching for the expansion of civil rights, and we look back upon them as great pioneers who opened up the doors for so many others, to a day, 50 years later, when the people who are marching against civil rights? How did that happen? Who are these people? And what do they represent in our society? Are they a sliver of our society? Or are they more representative? What do you know so far? Especially, put your historical hat on first, and then your dean's hat second.
Just a small question, right? So I think there are a lot of answers to that question, and I think a lot of people would answer it in different ways, but there are clearly a series of types of causes that I would point to, right? So I think one would be, and one way to think about who they are and what's happening is that it's a last gasp of protest against the 50 years of civil rights success. That, I think, is the most optimistic view one could take.
Last gasp.
Last gasp. That's the most optimistic view.
Right.
But I don't actually think it can be the last gasp unless we respond to stop it from growing, right? So one of the things that has really struck me in listening to people talk about these folks and who they are is they've been described as an unpopular minority. And when you think about 50 years ago, the civil rights struggle, who were the unpopular minorities? They were the civil rights activists and the civil rights activist allies, and they were the unpopular minorities, and they were being arrested, and the majority in the South, but elsewhere as well, were on the scale of white supremacists, right? And so to think how far we've come, that now the white supremacists are the unpopular minority, and a very bipartisan Congress unanimously votes to condemn what happened in Charlottesville, right? That's pretty far. That's a lot of progress. That's a big change. On the other hand, my scholarship a lot of it is about how unpopular minorities become majorities, right? How did the civil rights activists succeed? How did the social movements of the 60s succeed? And I think you can see the white supremacists are asking that question too, and they are modeling their movement on those movements. And history doesn't all go in one direction. It doesn't all go toward progress. And so I think whether they're a last gasp or not is an open question that has a lot to do with how we respond to it. But if I think about the causes, I think one cause is backlash. It's backlash about that 50 years of progress. I think it's also backlash against the Obama presidency. I think it's backlash against the Clinton presidential candidacy. So that's one piece of it. I think it's a political backlash. It's a racial and ideological backlash. I think there's clearly an economic component about who's been left behind in the new economic world order with the loss of industrial jobs, good industrial jobs. You know, you look post-recession, male unemployment is at higher levels proportionally than female unemployment, the areas that we have not come back yet are in what were good, well-paying, blue-collar jobs. So I think that's a piece of it. I think another piece of it is technological, right? So a lot of people are talking about the bubbles that we live in, how people communicate, the ability to only listen to people or get news from people you agree with. So I think that's part of it. One of the things, I'll stop in a second because I'm sure other people have ideas, but one of the things that I have found so challenging about when we discuss who they were and what they stood for, we often say white supremacists or the Klan or Nazis, neo-Nazis, but it doesn't quite capture what they're about, because they are about intolerance and bigotry writ large, right? So none of those words really say much explicitly about gender, for example, or about sexual orientation. But it's a whole constellation of ideologies that are about race and about religion and about sex and sexual orientation and ability, and that is a narrow level of acceptance that only includes a really tiny proportion of people, and then denigrates and excludes and hates everyone else. And so it's been a challenge to figure out what language do you use to talk about who they are when they hate so many.
When you say they, can we also, do you have a sense of what proportion of the people who are marching were women?
Oh, my sense is very, very small.
Very small.
It is largely young, white men.
Right. So let's internationalize this just for a moment. I think, Linda, you might be the best person to take this there. We see in other countries the rise of young men who were drawn to ISIS. We see the attraction of Boko Haram in Nigeria. What are we looking at? Are we looking at some sort of international phenomenon of young men who are essentially feel marginalized and left behind?
I think that's exactly what we're seeing as we look across Africa and other places in the world where you see young men who are in situations of hopelessness, in situations where they don't see a future, where they don't see opportunity. They're attracted to marginalization. They're attracted to organizations that offer them a reason for hope. There was a recent study done of interviews with young men who joined Boko Haram. And many of these young men said, it's $2,000, it's a job, it's a motorcycle, it's a way for us to make a living. And that's frightening when you think about how many young men are in that position and you think about what they do and the impact that they have on their societies in terms of killings, in terms of attacks against women, in terms of destruction of their communities. And for that reason, it's important that we start looking at how to address some of these root causes. And I don't compare them to white supremacists, although I think the demographic is the same in the sense that it's young men who have no opportunity. But I think their response has been very, very similar to what we're seeing here in the United States. We have an amazing program that we started under the Obama administration called the Young African Leaders Initiative. We brought in the first years of this program 500 young people across Africa, and University of Virginia was part of that program, hosting 25 of them here. And we had 50,000 young people applying for 500 slots. That's how much people are looking for opportunity. And then this very small program expanded to 1,000, but we have a network. The network has over 400,000 young people, and the number is probably bigger than that, of people who are engaged in looking for opportunities to give back and to contribute to their societies in a positive way. And so we need to look at how we do that here in the United States as well.
Linda, if I could interrupt for a minute, just because I need to. Some of our young African leaders that came here to the University of Virginia are in the room. And so I wanted to make sure. Please proceed.
Fantastic.
That's interesting. Lionel Tiger used to be a sociologist at Rutgers, wrote a lot about this, the problems of young men who are of an age when they're getting muscular, they want to give voice, and if they have no jobs, and because they have no jobs, they have women turn away from them. In the Middle East, there are studies about how women reject these men because they don't want to be involved with them. They're sort of, there's no future there. And they become even more frustrated. And women don't, women often play an anchoring role for a young man. They help him to settle down, to be, to cage it up, so to speak. And that's absent from their lives. And they're the expressions here that one has seen through history, Risa, that if young men are 18, 19, 20 years old and they have no future, they can get quite violent.
They can. I mean, most crime is committed by men in that age bracket, and then violence falls off quickly. I mean, I think it goes beyond, and you're obviously being glib, right? But it goes beyond just the caging, right? It's the responsibilities, it's the obligation to someone other than oneself. And I don't actually know. I haven't seen any data, but it would be interesting to see whether the men who are most involved today in the U.S. or elsewhere in these movements are single, whether they have jobs, whether they have partners. I haven't seen data like that. I think we have a hypothesis here, obviously,
right.
And I wouldn't be surprised if the hypothesis was right.
Yeah. And Linda, to go back to it, so how in these countries, which once looked to the United States as a role model, how are they responding to the Charlottesvilles and what they're seeing?
I think they look at what is happening, not just in Charlottesville, but what has happened across the United States. They're in shock, like many of us are in shock as well, because they have looked at the United States as a model, as a beacon of hope for those people who want human rights, who want inclusivity, for people who want to see their societies improve. The U.S. has been the model, and suddenly we're not the model anymore. And there's no one else that they feel that they can turn to. So I think there is this sense of hopelessness and a sense that they want this to be over very, very quickly so that we can continue to encourage and support young people in other countries. And it's about moral support. It's not money. It's not programs like YALI, which are extraordinary, but it's that moral support and hope that the U.S. provides for societies that I think they are worried will continue to deteriorate.
Please. Risa.
Can I add something?
Please.
So, when you talk to people about what happened in Charlottesville, there are lots of different kinds of reactions, right? And for many, there's shock, and for many, there's not shock, right? We live in a racially unequal world. Our country has never been the beacon that we would like it to be, and now that's not to say we haven't come a long way. We've been striving, we have aspirations, all of which I think make us a model in some ways. But to me, what happened on August 11th and 12th and what's been happening elsewhere as well, it doesn't seem so much to me that it's new that we suddenly see racism in our midst. What's new to me is the brazenness of it, clearly the perceived acceptability of it, of being so brazen. But I think, and this goes back to something that Greg said, I mean, the stories that we tell about the last 50 years are really stories in which we've succeeded.
Yeah.
And we are now an integrated society, and then this is shock, and it's out of place, and we don't know where it came from. But it's not true, right? We are still a quite segregated society. There is still a lot of racial and economic inequality, and the law has played, Greg and I were talking before we came in, about the role the law has played in that, and after playing a role of making possible increased equality in a formal way, ending segregation, ending overt discrimination, the law really stepped back, and for the last 40 years, 35 to 40 years, has allowed private orderings of the kind that Greg was talking about to resegregate and continue the economic inequality and the racial inequality that we see. And so I think this is a wake-up call. It's not that this is something new, but I think it has to be a wake-up call to remind us we made a lot of progress, but we didn't finish. And there's still so much more to do.
Let me pursue that with you and press you a little bit on this. Because I would like to know, as your committee meets, and you've been thinking a lot about what the path forward is for the University of Virginia, but first, is the legal profession, is the American Bar Association failing us by being so timid on these assaults on civil rights and on the constitutional order?
I wouldn't put it at the feet of the American Bar Association. I think
Well,
lawyers...
we take like Ken Frazier of Merck. When he stood up and was counted as a CEO, he put his entire company on the line. You know, he's got billions of dollars of investments that have to come in front of the Trump administration for approval in order to get drugs on the market. He put his entire company on the line to stand up for what he thought was right. Where are the lawyers?
Oh, they were in the airports last year.
Yeah, okay.
They filed 2 lawsuits. Actually, right now there are
Yeah.
2 major lawsuits against the white supremacists in Charlottesville filed by lawyers. So lawyers are in lots of different places, and I think a lot of lawyers are out there fighting this very aggressively, but they're handicapped by Supreme Court doctrine that's been in place for the last 35 years.
But couldn't they raise their voices about norms?
They can, and I think they are. I mean, I'm a big fan of lawyers. That might come as a surprise. and though I think there are lawyers who are not standing up, I think there are a tremendous number of lawyers who are, and I think there are lawyers in various levels of government who are doing so. There are lawyers in the Legal Aid Justice Center here in Charlottesville who are doing so, and in legal aid organizations and nonprofits like them all across the country. I do think it's a challenge to do so, and I'll just give a little primer on this, just very short, but this is what I'm referring to. When you think about what does the Constitution protect, and the Equal Protection Clause that no person, the state shall not deny any person the equal protection of the laws, the interpretation of that can mean one of 2 things. It can mean governments should not think about race, because when we used to think about race, we did a bad job. We allowed slavery, we allowed Jim Crow, we allowed segregation. So governments should get out of the business of thinking about race and allow civil society to do what it will do. Or civil society is itself unequal, and if governments get out of the business of race, civil society will remain unequal. And over the last 30 years or so, the courts have become more and more assertive about choosing option number 1 rather than option number 2. And so it has prevented states and localities from taking affirmative steps. And by that I don't just mean affirmative action as you have in your head, but lots of different kinds of affirmative steps to prevent resegregation, to maintain integration, to create greater racial equality. And so I think the lawyers are working hard. And some of the judges are working hard too. Don't get me wrong, there's lots of diversity among judges as well. But the framework that has been created has enabled a kind of race-neutral vision that everybody's racial group gets to exist in the world separate and apart from government intervention, and the government must be neutral as between them, and the world we live in is not a neutral one.
Well, you've certainly got a good point about the young lawyers who went out when the immigration rules came out. They went there to the airports. There were more lawyers in some airports than there were protesters. That's certainly true. And they've launched various civil rights, they've launched suits that are the beginnings of things. That's very true. But one doesn't have a sense of a national conversation about rights.
There should be, I agree.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You know, so the Ken Frazier example and a couple of others were, I think, newsworthy because of the heft of their organizations. They were also newsworthy because, as you say, business leadership was willing to stand up and say, this is the line. And I think that sometimes things make news that we get rewarded for doing that, which is just human. I wonder, when I think back to my point about McNamara in '63, the big way that was able to be executed was that the U.S. military could say, We will pull all the housing funds if you don't integrate the housing. We will pull the troops out of your restaurants. We will pull the troops out of your establishments in your community and your schools unless you proceed to do what we would like you to do. So it was the two hands of both the policy, but also the economic power that was able to do it. And I think that, I love that the attorneys are there. I feel like so often they are asked to be the voice of our conscience. And I wish candidly more often we as business leaders were the voice and conscience.
Point well taken. Yes, please.
So in terms of, I was thinking about the military while you were talking, and this doesn't come as news to you, but it also is a hierarchical organization.
It is.
In which, authority starts at the top and things are mandated. And we live in a democracy, right?
We do.
And so, when you think about Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation after that, it would have been a lot faster if you mandated from above, right? And we don't, and we have federalism, and we have divided government of all kinds, and that means that it's slow and it's messy, and we have a value. That's not to say we should live in an authoritarian state, right? That's to say we have a value of democracy, and we have a value of speech, and we have a value of allowing different parts of our society to execute their desires, their policies, their goals, their values. And that means that even when we do aspire, even when the Supreme Court says something, even when governmental agencies or officials say something, they can't just make it happen. And it always means it's partial and aspirational.
I mean, I eventually would like to, if there are questions from the audience, I'd like to get there, but we have a couple of things more to cover. Risa, you helped us understand the path here. What's the path forward? What role does this university play? What role should universities play in addressing the questions that come up out of these protests?
So I think this university plays a role it has always played from the very beginning.
Right.
I mean, this university was part of the building of democracy from the beginning, and our aspirations have always been partially fulfilled, but we continue to try to fulfill them. And I think UVA has always been a leader and needs to continue to be a leader. And in this sense, I think it requires us both looking inward and looking outward. So looking inward, and the Dean's Working Group has been working on safety and security issues, but then beyond that has been looking both inward and outward. And on the inward looking, it's to say to ourselves, once you are hit in the face with this kind of blatant and virulent racism, you have to look and ask yourselves, where can we still do better? How do people within our community feel? Obviously, events like that affect people in very different ways depending on who you are in relation to those messages of hate. I'm Jewish. The day after August 12th, my kids went to camp downtown. They're 11 and 14. This was their summer of independence, their summer when they got to walk on the downtown mall themselves and have lunch after camp and take the public bus home. And it did not occur to me that my son wears a shirt with Hebrew letters on it every day. He has multiple of them, but every day he wears a shirt with Hebrew letters on it. And they came home that day and they said, "Mommy, there were weird men out there." And I thought, do I have to forbid my son from wearing a shirt with Hebrew letters? Do I have to tell my kids they can no longer do this, right? So I think we all have stories about how this affected us, and it was different. And I think as a community, we have to ask ourselves, how do all the members of our community feel here?
And if I can add something, this is bigger than this university.
I totally agree.
And it's important what is happening here, and that it gets communicated more nationally, because we're seeing the same things happen at other universities. People have not lost their lives, thankfully, but swastikas have been found in dormitories at Georgetown. American University had bananas hung with the name of the president of the Student Association, who happened to be black. And there's a lot of fear being promoted across the United States. So to the extent that this university can broaden its discussion, as you're doing today, to encompass what is happening more nationally. I think it's important. And what this university does, and I think that is really important, is that you bring students together of different views and different backgrounds, and you provide them an opportunity, and hopefully a safe opportunity where they can have these kinds of discussions.
There's also a question for a lot of us who are more affluent and are white. Do we understand, are we still listening to the voices of Appalachia? Don't we have some responsibility to find ways for our students to get acquainted with the rest of America and the people who do feel marginalized?
So I think, no, I think we do, but I think that's also so difficult because of the way that these very things we've been talking about. There's certainly racial segregation. There's a good bit of economic segregation as well. And it feeds into the institutions, particularly the institutions that feed the machinery of our society, particularly at the top. And so that said, we know that leading elite institutions tend over time to be filled with people who are more affluent than not. We know that, even as we labor to change that. Those students then that would be in environments like this would be minorities. And then that feeling that they might have of wanting to feel measures of not fitting, of not being listened to, of wanting to resist, organizations that we should point out are increasingly female. The University of Virginia and other universities around the country have transitioned since the civil rights movement into institutions that are predominantly female. I don't want to sound conspiracy theory-like, but an institution run by a female president might be one where someone might think they would go to do the types of things that happened. I think that if I'm someone that feels that my voice isn't being heard, that I'm one of the men we talked about, as an institution that I could think represents many of the things that I find threatening, a university would be so.
Would what?
Would be one of those.
So I still don't understand how we close the communications gap. So that people, so when we talk about inclusion, it's of course minorities, it's of course people who are at the, are not like us, kind of quote, for majorities. But doesn't it include, people who are poor white guys who are, explosive and violent, but don't we have to find some way to bring them into the conversation?
I absolutely agree with that, and I think it's really important that they be brought into the conversation. I think coming from a poor black family, I have more in common with a poor white person than I have in common with you. Mm-hmm. And we never bring those commonalities together in a way that we understand that poor people, regardless of their race, have things in common, and that they need to be viewed in a more inclusive way. And I think it's important for the universities to reach out to these communities, to reach out to poor communities, whether it's here in Virginia or it's at Howard University in poor areas of the inner city of Washington, D.C., where marginalized people surround the universities but don't feel that the universities are part of their lives. And so I think that would be an important step forward.
I agree. I also think that, so I think where I was heading before was what we do within the community, but also what we do as an academic institution. And I think it's important both to bring people in, and one of the categories that certainly wasn't something people talked about when I was applying to college was first-generation students, which are not only minority students, right? The folks you're talking about are in that category too. So it's bringing people in, but it's also about, as a university, we are an institution of learning and an institution of scholarship. And when you talk about the commonalities, the cross-race class commonalities, it has always been something in the history of the United States, and as well as elsewhere, that those commonalities exist, and yet they get exploited. The racial differences get exploited. So it's not, oh, it just happens to be that these young white men who are economically dislocated have turned to racism. There are people who are bringing them in, and you were talking about this with Bogogram and other organizations too, right? Who see that vulnerability, who see the ability to divide people along racial lines who should and would otherwise have commonalities. And so I think there's a real place for universities, not only as models, not only as places of bringing people together through dialogue, which I think is crucial, but also because we will study these things, and we need to study them, and we need to take this new information and integrate it in, and not just UVA, though I think it is incumbent upon UVA, but universities more generally to ask, what is happening now? You know, what is this moment technologically that enables us to be in bubbles? How do we get out of that? We have communications departments and media studies departments thinking about that. We have the Woodson Institute thinking about race. You know, we have to think about it, I think, not only in this moment about this particular thing, but in the broader global context, the broader historical, economic, political context. And that's what scholars do, both as students and as professors.
Perfect. Let me shift gears just a bit, and then before we go to the floor. Even as we talk about some of the dark sides of what we've watched here in the last few months and experienced, can one find a lot of hope in what's happening among women right now? I think, well, two things. It's been very, very striking to me to have new leadership come up in other countries, many of whom are authoritarians, but in a number of instances now, countries are headed by, or the leader of a country are younger, new generation, who bring fresh view and are much more about the empowerment of women than what we've seen in the past. I think particularly of Canada with Trudeau. He's half people in his cabinet are women. He will not go on any panel like this that's not gender balanced. He's not in favor of, small steps. He's in favor of moving to balance, and that ought to be the standard. And it's the most popular thing he's doing. He's also very strong on immigration, bringing people in. He's gone out to airports to welcome people who are coming from places like Syria. And he has a very progressive sense, and women are stepping into those roles in a way that suggests, there can be real hope. And I also wonder about the response to this wave upon wave of allegations about harassment. It's a lot of women now are finding the courage to step up and say enough and put an end to this. And I wonder if it's really going to bring a change in our culture and that we can be encouraged about. Please, go ahead.
Well,
You got a good male voice in there.
David, as I think about that, tied to this notion that institutions of learning and institutions like the University of Virginia and other universities do help create the next set of leaders, then if we carried that thought forward, if the University of Virginia and other universities are now predominantly female, we heard last night at President Sullivan's salutation that in 2 years, the majority of the alumni of the University of Virginia will be women.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
You can clap.
Wow. You said over half?
I did.
Because when would the first women come? 1970?
That is correct.
And women have been more than a majority for some time. And
That's correct. The
What's
classes, over time, the classes grow, the university grows. But the part about this that's, if you talk then about an elite institution, and we and others are elite institutions, again, universities in general are institutions that help prepare the leadership for the next generation, then you take this view that over time, we will funnel, we will prepare, we will bring more women into the roles that will lead institutions. That, the fact that President Sullivan or that Dean Goluboff are first will soon leave us. As that happens, what I anticipate is that with more women in the machinery that guides the society, any society, ours particularly, you might find the very things that you're talking about. You might also find some people that will feel increasingly left out, which is why I think your earlier warning to us is real. But I think that my hopeful part is the same hopeful part I felt when I saw that President Sullivan had been named. That as more women lead organizations, there might be more of that type of openness and understanding.
But I wonder if in reality, the big hope is that women will become our new voices of conscience and that they can raise the level of quality of life, because I think they do play that role, and I think they're increasingly playing that role. It is also true that women who go out of business schools or other institutions and go work in corporate life, in professional life, their numbers get winnowed down very quickly. Their proportions get winnowed down, especially when there's a first child. And the latest numbers I've seen in terms of when we're going to get to equality have stretched out 50 or 60 years.
Okay.
And it's, so in terms of economic life, I'm not so sure women are making the advances we would have assumed by now.
And it's not only economic life, right? If you look at our elected officials, women are still not represented in proportional numbers. So I do think there's a lot to the demographics, right? And getting more women in the door and then out the door is the first step, but it's obviously not the only step, right? And we have to make workplaces more amenable. I think, frankly, when I think about what the work is that remains to be done, it's that, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think women have changed their conception of themselves, and it's much broader than it once was, but men haven't necessarily changed their conceptions of themselves.
Men are struggling with figuring out who they are, right?
But engaging in childcare and engaging
Right.
in home work, that men have made fewer strides in that direction than
Right.
women have made toward the workplace. And so long as there's not childcare and there aren't ways for women to do both, and there aren't men who are wanting to do both, then it's going to continue to be the case that women aren't equally represented. Can I have one other thing?
Sure.
The other thing I would say, and I'm usually an optimist, but in this I'm not going to sound like an optimist. One of the things that I did mention earlier when I was talking about the causes, I think is Black Lives Matter. And I've been thinking about the sexual harassment coming to light in similar ways as Black Lives Matter, right? As that we now are seeing forms of abuse, forms of oppression, forms of exploitation that had previously been hidden. On the one hand, police abuse, and on the other, against mostly young black men of color, and on the other hand, sexual harassment. And I think bringing them to light is hugely important, so that we can see the problem, we can name the problem, people can speak about it, but it doesn't end, it doesn't, bringing it to light doesn't mean it goes away. And I don't know that we've figured out yet, and in part because I do think once you articulate it and you have a movement, you're going to get a counter movement, and that requires a counter movement.
What I'm wondering about is we talked about the backlash earlier on, and one could argue that the votes on Tuesday this past week were the backlash against the backlash. That the resistance to the first, the protests and the neo-Nazis is rising up, and could that be an omen of good things to come?
Yeah.
I think it's a first step, but
Yeah.
I don't think it's certainly not a final step.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to be careful that we don't express joy over what happened in the Tuesday election, because we have to keep up the efforts to keep people engaged and make sure people are informed so that we can continue this movement. Because there will be a backlash against the backlash against the backlash.
Well said. Well said. Okay, the floor is open and the hands are shooting up. Yeah, you were up before I even opened my mouth, so please, we got microphones.
Hi, I'm Missy Cassels-Handy from Florida, and the reason I say I'm from Florida is that in Florida, our average age is, I normally bring it down by a lot, and I'm now 57. So one of the things that I see, and you see this, is in Florida we see a big fear of loss of control. and a fear of foreign, or to them, they're not foreign religions, and we haven't talked much about religion, but it seems to me this fear is a common thread. Fear of a woman president, fear of a black president, fear of a Jewish president, fear of something, fear of a Catholic one when it was Kennedy, right? So this fear seems to me, and fear of loss of control, fear of my world being disintegrated from underneath me, and is Armageddon around the corner, which you hear a fair amount, and I heard it for 8 years in Florida, a lot of guys going, I'm really afraid. So is that a common thread?
Volunteer?
I would argue that it is a common thread, and it's not just here in the United States. And fear is manipulated, and it's taken advantage of, and you can take people's fears and put them in a box and then get them to do things that they might not otherwise do because they're afraid. So I think you're exactly right that we have to be concerned about how people use fear to change the narrative that we are dealing with. So there's fear of black men. I regularly tell my son, you're a big black man. People are going to fear you. You have to watch how you walk into a room because of the fear factor. And many of us don't get that. The people who are afraid of us, or the people who are afraid of, don't realize the impact that they have on other people. So I do think this is a conversation that, again, we need to address to alleviate some of these fears.
The thing I'd add is, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky won the Nobel Prize on the basis of a lot of things. But one of those was that for the average person, the feeling of a loss of current position is far greater a motivator than the opportunity to gain something. So if we hark back to why integration in various forms, gender, religion, so on and so forth, might be exactly what David described, when paired against a message that says there may be a loss of position, what their work would suggest is that it'll have a harder time gaining purchase.
Machiavelli made this argument 500 years ago. Change is hard because there are lots of people who have an investment in the status quo, and those who would benefit from change are scared of it. They're a little fearful, and it makes it really hard. And it's been true century after century. Please, where's the hand here, please?
Thank you. My name is Joseph, and I'm a Community Solutions Fellow. I'm based in Portland. So I came in August, and when I was just arriving in Portland, we had the incident on Charlottesville, the attacks. And in Portland, there has been a debate around how the justice system and the media are dealing with the issues of terrorism, sexism, and racism. And one of the debates that I've been part of raised the issue that the way the justice system and the media address people who are involved in terrorist attacks and racism and sexism is differentiated basing on the race. So if we have got a male person attacking, for example, the Las Vegas shooting, he was addressed as a white male shooter. But if we have a situation of somebody coming from a minority like the black and the Muslims, they are labeled as maniac, terrorist. They are given all these big names. And I begin to reflect about this issue, and I think it's something maybe that we should start looking at. How do we address these people? Because if we have got one group being addressed with a red carpet, even if they are committing crimes against humanity, and then we've got another group being addressed with very harsh names, and I think it's something very complicated. I don't know how you view it, and is there something that we can do to change the way we are dealing with these issues?
I don't know if I'll address your question, but I remember being with a group of people as this shooting in Las Vegas took place among African Americans and foreigners. And their first comment was, God, please don't let it be a black man, and don't let it be a foreigner. Because we understand that that would be viewed in a different way. And so when the press reports things as you have described them, and we are aware that that is the way it's reported, it does feed into a different set of fears.
It's also true that when guns are in play versus non-guns, there's a different conversation. There's an attempt to defend Second Amendment rights, and Second Amendment is important. So there's been this sense of powerlessness to deal with the gun issue, but I would point out that in this last election here in Virginia, that guns actually helped the Democratic candidate, and restrictions on guns actually played in that person's favor in the gubernatorial race, which suggests that the language that we use, and we so often misuse or abuse after incidents, and I think you're absolutely right about that, it's not being lost on the voting public that these are skewed conversations. And so I don't think that the public necessarily just, whatever the conversation is, necessarily follows. People are actually beginning to exercise some judgment that's independent of what they're hearing in the inflammatory rhetoric that is used. Let's please go ahead, Risa.
One small thing. I agree with your point, and I think underscoring it is if you look at data from, say, the Southern Poverty Law Center or other organizations that track white supremacists and track terrorist organizations, the vast majority of terrorist attacks in the United States are committed by white supremacists. They are committed by whites and motivated by white supremacy. They are not committed by people of color, by foreigners, and so it's appalling that the coverage is as it is, but it's even more appalling because of the enormous gap between that coverage and who is actually committing terrorist attacks in the United States.
Good point. Please, yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Faith Frampton, and I'm an educator of middle schoolers and the co-chair of my diversity committee at the school. And I want to revisit, if I can, the discussion of young men and their violence and their fear, and how we as parents and as educators can work to prevent that fear and also to prevent this violence. What are some practical things that we can do to address that? Thank you.
Good question.
I guess I've signaled that I'm a parent of two boys. Wow. So I felt for Risa having to speak for all the legal profession. Let me now say I don't want to speak for all parents. That aside, one of the things that I think we're trying to do is to normalize or change the perception that the experience of working under the leadership, working for someone who is a woman, is not a sense of loss. To take the notion that the starting point, for some men, there's a thing that at least in some ages, including the period I grew up in, that there's some sense of demasculization. I don't know if that's the right word, but being your masculinity being questioned. If you find yourself in a position where, as a man, you're not controlling the situation, dominating, those sorts of things. This was kind of stark to me early in my life. One of my very first jobs was in retailing in New York City. It was a 70% female environment. Men were in the minority. I again learned that was another bubble. When I got out into the workplace later, that was not at all the case, but it was the way my career started. What I think we're trying to do in our family is to give our boys the sense that if they don't find themselves in those positions of authority and control, they haven't lost anything. And that's not easy, given the gentleman over here was talking about the overriding messages. There are a lot of overriding messages in film, in what kids read, that send either explicit or implicit guides that boys are supposed to lead, so to speak. And so ferreting that and thinking about that is not easy. And so I think if we could just change from, again, I'm speaking more as a parent, if I could just change in my boys the sense that that wouldn't end up being something they would be having a sense of loss about, and that they could see the opportunity in that, that would be, in my mind, one of the things that would be a great gift I could give them.
May I just make one other suggestion? There are a growing number of organizations now where young people can go and be of service. Can they be in a service project or service year where they're in more integrated situations, and young men can get accustomed to working with across racial lines, across gender lines, and they become much more community oriented. I think of City Year, for example, which is now in many cities, and people spend a year to 2 years, working in city schools and really working on the dropout problem, trying to encourage young kids to stay in. They've had remarkable results. Teach for America. There are a lot of organizations like this, and that's why there are a number of us who really have come to believe in national service, and that is every young person ought to be give a year back or 2 years back to the country, not be required, but it ought to be part of our culture. So that, what we found in World War II was if a Saltonstall wound up saluting some Polish kid from Brooklyn, that really democratized society, and it gave everybody a sense of belonging to something that was that they had in common. That's why, as opposed to diversity, the idea of inclusion brings people together, and it includes everybody. But the degree that young people can be in service projects, I think you generally find their civic engagement goes up, they vote in greater numbers, but very, very importantly, they do have a sense of a stake in a community. Please, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Buki Shonibara and I'm from Nigeria. I work with victims of the Boko Haram insurgency. So I get to go to a lot of those communities where children have been displaced. And I'm also one of the founders of the Bring Back Our Girls movement. So when Boko Haram was mentioned, it actually pricked me. Now, top of my head, what comes to mind is comparing what is happening in the northeast of Nigeria with what we saw that happened in Charlottesville. I'm looking at the common factors and the variable factors and trying to pose a question as to what can we do, who should be leading this effort that we should look at. Now, I look at issues around identity. Some of the boys that were abducted, radicalized and conscripted by Boko Haram, where that effort was successful by Boko Haram leaders using religion as the basis, considering the fact that they use extreme Islamic injunctions to conscript these boys. Now, for a lot of them, they simply use that, but they don't understand that from the Islamic perspective. So when you ask an average young Boko Haram member, they tell you that they don't even know the portion of the Quran where those injunctions that was used to conscript them are found. So they don't even know. So that tells you that there is something more. So for some of those boys that we spoke with, one is a quest for identity. And I don't know if that also plays out within the United States. These boys are looking for where they can be accepted, where they can be named. One of them told me that he joined Boko Haram because he simply just liked the way they are organized, the way they wear some kind of uniform. So there is that quest for identity. There's also the part of grievance where people just are grieved about something. And I think that's the question for us that work in this space. What are people aggrieved about? For those people back home, they believe they are defending others. For them also, they are actually, quite concerned about the poverty level. And then there's quest for more. So the question is, what is the more that these people are asking for? And then there's the economic factor. I was surprised that you mentioned poverty. So the question for me then is, what should we be looking at? Looking at the variable factors and the common factors. Back home also is the challenge of education. And who should be leading this effort and how should it be done? Thank you.
Can I start with a response? I think you almost answered your own question because you laid out all the factors, and all of these are underlying factors that are contributing to these young men being susceptible to being recruited by Boko Haram or encouraged to participate in white supremacist ideology. So the ideology is used to draw them in. But they're attracted not for the ideology, they're attracted because they don't belong. They're attracted because they are aggrieved. They're attracted because they're poor. And these organizations address all those issues. So the answer is, how do we address these grievances? How do we deal with this in the education system? How do we look for opportunities for jobs? I mean, Africa is the fastest growing population. It is an extraordinarily youthful population, somewhere around 60% of the population under the age of 20, and I've seen figures even under the age of 15. And so the factor of not having hope for education, not having opportunities for employment, not being able to contribute to their societies and being respected by their societies are all issues that need to be addressed. So what we as development institutions, as governments need to do is start to look at those underlying problems and see where we can inject more support to providing to these young men so that they can develop a level of hope, a level of feeling that they have opportunity and that there's a future for them. And I think it's the same issue in this country as well as in Africa.
Yeah, let's see, please.
That's okay. Hi, my name is Amani. I'm from Sudan. I just wanted to address actually some of the specific things that you said, kind of in relation to what she said. You were talking about the demographic and you're saying that it's young males who are hopeless. I think the comparison personally between ISIS and what happened here is completely far-fetched. White males, thank you. White men are the most privileged demographic in the US and pretty much in the world, doesn't matter what country you go to. So comparing people who are, in these different kind of countries, and I'm from a Muslim country and from a country where people have gone to ISIS, and it's not, people are not privileged. They're going because they don't have money, they're going because their families have been killed, they're going because whether they want revenge. And I think the two topics essentially are very contrast. The fear that comes from terrorism will hit anyone, whether you're black, Muslim, white, it doesn't matter. Whereas what's happening with Black Lives Matters movement and everything else and institutional racism within the police is a very specific demographic. You're hitting black people that has happened in your history, that over the years of living here, people have been enslaved in that way. And so my question is, to what extent do you think education institutions, law institutions, basically every institution that the foundation of the US is built on, still perpetuate these problems because they're not solving them when they actually occur? These statues are still up. Black people have to walk past these statues of people that have killed their families and generations and expected to just move on and accept that they're there, or even sit by them or underneath them. So to what extent do you think education systems aren't actually doing enough, in a sense? Yeah. And as far as I'm aware, I'm not 100% sure, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but people that were in these protests were also students or part of the student demographic that were actually part of the white supremacists. So essentially, as I was saying, they're not privileged. They're going to a very fine institution, getting a degree.
Could I take part of that?
Yeah, sure.
So I would agree with a number of things you said, but there are a couple things that I see a little different. So it turns out that the University of Virginia Center for Politics just did a study on the opinions of Americans about race relations in America. This just came out. It's actually quite disturbing. Among the things that it points out is 1/3 of all respondents said that they felt that the U.S. needed to find some way to protect its European heritage. I want to be very clear, protect its European heritage. Another third said that they had no opinion on that question. Now, by the way, they also had the I don't know enough option. So about 2/3 of respondents gave either a positive opinion about that statement. The way I see that statement, protect European heritage, is that white men, white Americans may be more privileged on average, but they might not be feeling that they aren't losing ground. By the way, it's Asian Americans who have the highest incomes in the United States and the highest wealth in the United States, relatively speaking, just if we're going to be clear. So the messages I hear when I hear these discussions about, a return to the old days, walling off communities, they seem to me, in my ear, to be less this recognition that some may have more privilege than others, more the world as I have experienced it or anticipated it won't be what it has been. I also think, in particularly those that are not college educated, although you're quite right about race, we know that actual incomes when inflation adjusted have actually not increased over time. The American story is a story about you come here and all the doors will be open to you and you can have great success, and that, in fact, each generation will continue to do better than the prior generation. What happens if you begin to believe, and this is part of hillbilly elegy, by the way, which is what people are experiencing in China in the Appalachians. What happens if that very strong mythology ceases to be true? Well, then the way I see the very phenomenons you're talking about, and I'm only speaking on this one part of it, that while I could be the group of individuals that typically has had more privilege, authority, and power, if I feel that our relative position is beginning to decline, back to this notion of losses versus gains, I will feel especially threatened. That's how I see that.
Sure, I'll add something. So one thing, two of the organizers of the marches on the 11th and 12th were graduates of the University of Virginia. I don't know that there were any current students involved in those activities, but they were two graduates of the University of Virginia, and I think it is the case that as a nation, I mean, we have the myths, these lovely myths that Greg has referred to. They've never been the reality. I think they've been more the reality for some who I think are clinging to the myths, but we have always been a nation that aspires to and describes ideals of democracy and equality in the midst of slavery, discrimination, segregation, and inequality, right? That is what we've been from the very beginning. Slavery came to these shores in the 17th century. It was racialized from the beginning. I mean, that is our past, and the institutions that were built on the backs of slaves, and that is the history of the nation. It's the history of many of our institutions. It's the history of this institution, and I think excising that is a really hard thing to do, and I think the university's been trying. I think the nation has been trying in various ways, right, to go back to the very beginning of the conversation, 50 years of civil rights change, but success is difficult, it's elusive, and one of the things I've been thinking about as we've had these conversations is 50 years is nothing. I mean, we're so impatient, and I think that's a sort of trait, right? If we want to go generalize.
There's nothing for historians, but if you're living those 50 years, it seems like a long time.
It does, but if you think about 400 years,
Yeah.
450 years of slavery, racism, and inequality, to think that we could just get rid of it in 50, I think we were overly ambitious. And then to declare, I think part of it also about this sense of loss is that we declared victory too early. And as a result, everybody thought, so if we're now on an equal playing field, why is Black Lives Matter out there complaining, right? And if we're all on an equal playing field, why is there affirmative action? And so the narrative that we tell, that it's done and it's over, really, I think, contributes to this sense that others are getting and I'm not.
And if I could just comment on the comparison with ISIS or Boko Haram, there's no comparison in terms of what they do, but when you start to look at some of the underlying causes, the grievances, the feeling that a lifestyle is being threatened, there are still some of the same underlying causes, and some of the solutions are the same.
We're going to have time for a couple more. I don't know where the hook is here. Aha, there's the hook then, indeed. Okay.
Hi, I'm Julie Baird. I'm at the Curry School. So we haven't talked about religion much. Have not talked about religion much, and I would love to hear just some comments about whether you think what's going on in our houses of worship. Are they moving us towards equality in any way, or away from, or holding status quo, and then perhaps internationally as well?
One of the things I regularly hear for years is the most segregated time in America is 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings when you go around to churches. But also it's when you look at the narrative, and I'm not a religious scholar, I'm a believer. When you look at the narrative, I sometimes wonder, am I the same religion as some of the other Christians I see? I always say, when I think of racism or perceptions of racism, I had a conversation on race, and I said, one of my perceptions of racism, anyone from my generation who tells me they're from the South and they went to a Christian school is telling me something about themselves. They're telling me that their parents did not want them to go to integrated schools. And the Christian schools, to me, represented segregation and racism. And so I think there is a religious discussion to be held here about what our religion means and how we define that religion individually and as a race, because again, religion justified slavery. Religion justifies a lot of the violence that we see happening today. So I think there's a conversation that we need to have on how our religion perceives how our environment and how our society functions today.
I'd like to separate religion and the institutions that practice religion, because those might be different. The comment made earlier by our friend from Nigeria about people who had not really deeply read the Quran, yet were acting on some of the things that they assumed were in the Quran. Well, had she not said the Quran when I was a young man, I would have said, well, she was talking about people who are using the Bible. I would have thought that was the way I grew up, that there were people that had read the Bible and there were people that were quoting what they believed was in the Bible, but perhaps had not really read it. But it had become a very reified and strong belief that they were living out. And so, I think the institution that someone finds their time in may be quite different from the actual strictures, beliefs of the religion itself. And that's where the individualized interpretation occurs. Linda, I have to say one thing. I've been talking a lot about if the segregated hour in Sunday at 11, one of the more integrated hours would be later on in the day when NFL football goes on. And on Monday night, you could argue is the most integrated hour. But someone pointed out to me that that hour is always with someone of the same race. And that what's happened for the NFL this year is that the fact that the NFL presents a wonderful, inclusive picture, entertaining picture, that there were some other problems that existed in the large society which were now intruding on that space. And as it intruded on that space, some people felt really sold something that they didn't want. Some other people were feeling that, well, now this feels like a more realistic expression. And so in either of these two examples, the NFL or churches, there's something about the way we want to experience it that is being then curated in ways that fit and don't fit.
Last word. Teresa, you have
We all vote for you.
final thought?
No, I guess my last word, because I am an optimist, my last word would be, look at all of you and look at this conference and look at the 50,000 people who applied to the State Department program, and when I think about is this going to be a last gasp or not, I think it's up to everyone, and having conversations like these in as many forums as we can, and taking on the leadership roles that we can, both our students, our communities across the globe, and I think we swallow this up. And we can, but none of it, I think when I look at history, it only happens because people do things. And so it doesn't happen just because there are demographics. It doesn't happen just because there are economics. People are doing things, and it doesn't only have to be those people who are doing things. It's all of us who are doing things. So I would end with a call to arms. I would like to see Charlottesville not be a lament, but a call to arms.
Good, good. Risa, thank you for an appropriate close. I walk away from here believing, as you do, that this is a call to arms. There was a time a few years ago when we spoke rather confidently that the long arc of history points toward justice. And now we're a lot less certain of that than we were. There is fear, and I think today's conversation underscored there's also complexity. These are not easy issues. There are a lot of interweaving things here that one has to think about carefully. But if we're not sure anymore, the real point is that destiny still rests in our hands. That it is up to the folks like us to figure out, okay, what role do we want to play? And I must say, I walk away from here again emphasizing how important it is at this summit to see how many women are standing up with courage to shape the future. And that gives me more hope than anything. I think we do owe, again, a word of thanks to Risa Sullivan for her presidency and for bringing this together. I wanted to say a word of thanks to Stuart Gamish, who from the Morven programs helped to sponsor this, put this together. But I think a special word of thanks is due to our panelists who were so terrific today. Thank you all. Thank you very much.